Hello everyone, I'm Marty Pospischil.
And I'm Adam Pospischil.
And welcome to another Fireside Chat. And today we are going to chat about something a little bit more current.
Timely.
Timely, that's the word I'm looking for. Something timely, and it's the new Home Buyer Rescission Period, which is coming out January 1st of 2023, coming out very shortly. What does it mean? How does it work? We're going to have a little chat on that today so you better understand that upcoming rescission period. So very good. Adam, why don't we talk about firstly what the home buyer rescission period is?
Totally. So at the spirit of it, what they're doing is it's a pretty wide sweeping piece of legislation. It's going to affect almost every real estate transaction that takes place in the province. And the spirit of this and the reason that they're doing this is to give buyers a legislated amount of time to do any sort of due diligence that they need to in the process of purchasing a property.
Yeah, and it's actually, it makes sense that this is in place because sometimes I see how this came about in the heated period of buying a home and intense competition, not happening right now, but in those periods where we have very strong active markets, people are making subject-free offers of purchase and sale, and the government's trying to protect them in that particular situation.
Exactly. That's the best way to describe it. I think it's a piece of consumer protection legislation, very similar to what's been in place for years and years in the pre-sale side of things, where they have a 7-day rescission period. It's looking and feeling a little bit like that in some ways.
Yeah, and that's been around for a long time,
Absolutely.
Part of Redma. Yeah, absolutely. So very interesting. So let's talk about what types of properties the rescission period includes.
Yeah.
We can do a little rundown here, Adam.
Totally, yeah. So, it's interesting. Again, it's going to include pretty much everything within the province. Some small exemptions, so we'll talk about that. So, primarily any detached home, semi-detached home, townhome, apartment, residential strata lot. So you can see from that list that's going to include, probably 90+% of the transactions that take place, probably 95+%. Or manufactured home. Don't see a lot of that, of course, in the Vancouver area, but that'll also include co-ops as well within that. So basically, we have a narrow band of exemption, primarily extending towards leasehold properties. In Vancouver, we certainly do have some of that on some of the band lands here. The City of Vancouver leasehold that exists, CMHC leasehold. So those are going to be exempt, which is interesting. I guess there's some reasoning rationale behind that. Sales by auction and sales by court order, so any sort of foreclosure would be exempt. But the important thing to remember is if you're buying or selling a house, condo, townhome, primarily will be affected by it.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And it's interesting you brought up leasehold. That is something that does happen a fair amount. A number of our transactions every year are leasehold, and there's kind of two types of leasehold. There is leasehold land, where you've got that head lease that is leased, and you could have a strata building on top of it, and you can also have freehold land with a leasehold interest in the improvements.
Right.
So anything that has the word leasehold in it will be exempt from this rescission period.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting.
Yeah.
And the big amount that we're talking about is
0.25%. So
0.25, yeah.
Easiest way to remember it, every $1 million, it will be $2,500.
Right.
Simple calculation.
Right. And in Vancouver, that works. If you're buying maybe in Winnipeg, it's a different example.
There you go. Fortunately, it's only a BC legislation, so they don't need to worry about that yet,
exactly.
I guess. So.
Very good point. That's an excellent point you made there.
Yeah.
So 0.25%, $2,500 for every $1 million in purchase price. And it runs, interestingly enough, for 3 business days. Now, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What is a business day? A business day technically is Monday to Friday, excluding holidays. And the list that are excluded are, of course, the Sundays, Christmas Day, Good Friday, Easter Monday, Canada Day, Victoria Day, BC Day, Labor Day, Remembrance Day, Family Day, and New Year's Day, and December 26th. And any other day of mourning or celebration that the government deems an official, maybe one-day holiday.
So it's kind of like all your traditional stats, that would be in addition, and like you said, anything else that gets added to commemorate some sort of event. Exactly. So
fair enough. And it has to, now, so let's give an example, because that's the best way to understand a new concept like this. It's Monday. You've been a successful buyer on a property, and you get an accepted offer without any subjects, for example, at 3 p.m. on Monday. When does that rescission period begin? And it's very clear the way it's legislated. It begins on Tuesday. No matter what time you reach that accepted offer on Monday, it starts the next business day. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday till 11:59 p.m., you are allotted a rescission decision. You can walk away from that purchase. Now, if there's a holiday in the middle of the week, for example, say Wednesday was a holiday, then you've got, that doesn't count, you've got now until Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, now you've got until Friday, end of the day. So it's 3 days, but it does not include Saturday, Sunday, or any other holiday. So that's kind of interesting how that clock works.
Yeah, and I think that's a good common sense way that they've put it together, because then there's no ambiguity. If it was accepted, fully accepted contract on Monday, it's going to just run for the following day.
Right.
Very nice and clear.
Very clear. Yeah. 3 days from the point at which the contract is accepted, not the date at which the contract was signed, but when that final initial goes in the contract, if you're still negotiating for a day or two.
When you have a binding agreement between two parties.
Exactly. That's when the clock starts ticking, the next business day.
Right.
Fair enough. And it's got to be served a certain way. Now, I notice we've got fax machines still in there. Now, I gave up our fax machine about 10 years ago.
You might be able to go into a museum, find a fax machine, and send your right of rescission.
Or a doctor's office or a lawyer's office.
Yes, that's true. They would be there. Yeah.
So fax is an acceptable way of serving that rescission.
Don't try and fax us.
We don't have a fax machine. I think there's an app you can get for that.
Yeah.
Registered mail or an email with a read receipt. And the realtors are allowed to serve the notice and receive the notice with read receipts representing their clients, or the buyer, I think, can do it directly to the seller as far as the legislation goes.
So I'd expect probably, and because this legislation is not yet in place, I expect that's probably how it's going to work. It's going to be by email. The BC Real Estate Association has created a standard form that fulfills the rescission requirements, and there's some detail on that we won't get into too much. But I imagine it will be primarily by email, realtor to realtor.
Right. Yeah. That makes total sense. Now, here's where the next question comes up. That we're getting asked a lot. Okay, Marty, Adam, I'm making this offer on this property, and I know I've got this rescission period, but I'm going to have my regular subjects as well. I'm buying a strata property, so I want to have the right to review the minutes. I want to have an inspection. I want it subject to financing, and I also want it subject to reviewing the disclosure statement and title search, for example. Now, those other subjects might be for a week, right? It might be for an entire week where you would actually designate a day when those subjects must come off. And in that case, your rescission period still begins on the next business day, that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, regardless of your subjects going to the following week.
Totally. So they're kind of independent in a lot of ways, right? And they can run concurrently. That's important to remember too. Your subject date is not in addition to that. And like you said, I think the best way to look at that is and understand that is that, of course, the subjects, in most cases in residential transactions, are going to have a specific day. Say it will be November 30th or whatever it might be, whereas the rescission period will just be talking about business days.
Absolutely, and not to be confused with one another, rescission period is you changing your mind and buying the property for no reason at all, 3 business days. The other subjects are subjects, and you must do your due diligence to satisfy those subjects. You've got to read the minutes, you've got to apply for your financing, you must do all of those things, and then still, if you're not happy with any of those conditions being met, then you can walk away in your subject period.
Absolutely, and the important distinction between the two, if you're involved in a transaction here, is if you are not removing your conditions or your subjects on an offer, you wouldn't be responsible for the rescission period if those subjects were still, in place up till a certain day. But if you were rescinding your offer using the rescission period, then you'd be responsible for that 0.25%.
Exactly.
So if those are happening within the same time period, say within the first 3 days there, you'd want to be super super clear about the fact that you're not removing subjects or that you're rescinding, because there's a financial penalty.
Very different.
Yeah.
You're right, absolutely. If you're rescinding, you must pay that 0.25%, and that will be deducted from your initial deposit on the contract. So we're going to start having deposits on contracts now.
Absolutely.
Initially, not just on subject removal. There might be an increase. There might be a 2-step or a 1-step up front, but money will be collected now with offers, which I don't think is that bad a thing. Right?
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting part about this legislation. I think generally people might worry that this would make buyers insincere about things and making frivolous offers, but I think in some ways it might be the opposite, because when people put down a deposit on anything, whether you're buying a car or a home or whatever it is, there is there's a bit of a sense of commitment there, perhaps, that might overcome that frivolousness people are worried about. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the way it would work is that deposit, of course, gets held in trust by the buyer's brokerage, and the 0.25%, if the contract was rescinded by the buyer, gets deducted from that deposit and forwarded on to the seller.
Yeah.
And again, then the residual amount of the deposit, if there is any, gets refunded back to the buyer. Okay. Now you can't. This is very important. BCFSA and BCREA did some very informative seminars, and a point came up. Well, can you contract out of the rescission period? And the answer is no. This is legislated. Everybody must follow it, regardless of what a buyer and seller agree to in the contract.
Yeah.
It must be adhered to, and it's there whether it's written in, crossed out, removed, or contracted away, it's still going to be in place. I thought that was very good to be clear on.
Totally, and whether it's a transaction being handled by realtors, which is most of the transactions in the province, whether it's one being handled by lawyers, or if it would be, for example, just buyer and seller coming together like a for sale by owner, everything across the board will be affected and will be requiring this rescission period. There's no way to get around it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And another question that does come up is what if the initial contract didn't have any deposit monies? Okay, and he rescinded within the 3-day period, and that money is owing, but there's no money in a trust account to take it out of. Probably best as a seller to avoid that. You will have to get legal counsel on how to get that money.
But essentially the buyer is owing it to the seller at that point.
Exactly.
It would be an amount owing.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is an amount owing. That's why we want to bring in a lawyer and get a lawyer involved. Much easier if there's money in trust for that transaction. So that's a really important thing to have up front.
And like you said, I think that's primarily how the mechanism will be now. Every seller is going to want to see some upfront earnest money. Like you said, maybe it will be just the 0.25, maybe it'll be a bit more. But we're kind of going back in time. We haven't seen initial deposits in quite some time.
I know.
But now we're going back in and adding that in again. So we'll see.
Everything comes back, like bell-bottom jeans. Eventually they came back in. They're gone now.
Yep.
Actually, I had a pair. Sorry, I'm going off
You
topic.
should have kept them.
Johnny made me get rid of them.
I read an article. They were talking about, we're getting off topic here now, but I read an article this past week that somebody found a pair of Levi's in a mine in the U.S. and they sold them for $250,000 to somebody, a retro collector.
Okay, I'm going to go home and talk to Jeremy right now because my old bell-bottom jeans could be worth something.
Yes, or not.
Or not. Likely not, but it could have been.
There you go.
You never know.
Yeah.
That is our discussion for today, you guys. I'm really happy you were able to join us. And thanks, Adam. That was a good chat.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, Home Buyer Rescission Period, effective January 1st, 2023.